Hello again. Thank you for joining me on another video. So today I was going to talk about the difference between spiritual awakening and a spiritual initiation. So they sound like they should be exactly the same thing. The difference is the path and where it ends up leading you. A spiritual initiation can be quite intense. It is a challenge by the spiritual realms to see if you're up to muster. So if you imagine what you know of the spiritual awakening journey and what that feels like, and the form of existential crisis that it can imbue in its subjects, where everything that you once knew suddenly gets kind of upended. The meaning and purpose you had for your life, which was handed down to you from your parents and society, and different roles and responsibilities that you took on in life, suddenly this dissolves at the same time that you lose a little sense of the egoic nature, and that life really isn't all about yourself, and it is actually quite vast and large. And so you embark on the spiritual journey to discover all the ways that you're actually connected to infinite reality and everything that entails. That's the spiritual awakening journey, and it is super intense. And it leaves you feeling very in awe of life, in awe of the miracle of the universe and our place in it, and how amazing it is to experience these things. The spiritual initiation journey is a little bit different. It's a testing of your mettle. It's a testing of how well you can interact in abstract thought, abstract realms, the realms of energy and intention, the realms and the planes of existence that exist primarily outside of the 3D physical density that we're living in, right? So an initiation is going to occur for a few different reasons. Either you have expressed an interest and you are pushing the doorbell to get the spiritual world, the supernatural world to answer, or you've done this before and it's a bit of a wake-up call, so you can get back to your soul's path. You've done enough of the regular living. It's time to get back to the course you were on before or previously in other lifetimes. And it's quite intense. So it does involve a spiritual awakening. You have to be awake in order to be initiated. Sometimes they occur at the same time. Sometimes the initiation is what prompts the awakening. So I had a few of these because I denied wholeheartedly the first two, really, that came through. And I'll tell you a short, brief story about one of them. So in the first one, I was only 19 years old, and it was a couple years after I had the accident where I fell off the cliff. And I had gone back to school, finished high school, and I really hadn't decided what I was going to do with the rest of my life. I think I had taken a few classes at the community college, but I really hadn't decided on a direction. And I had always had this really strange relationship with God and the spirit world, and it never really fit anywhere. It didn't line up with anything that I heard other people saying about it. It was really quite unique in that way. There was no denying that there was a presence with me that responded to questions I had, and that I could sense things that it didn't seem like were regularly talked about by others. But there wasn't a whole lot of meshing. I couldn't find a way to mesh it into a future goal that made any kind of sense. So I was still very much on the trajectory of, get a job and raise a family and that sort of thing. So even though I knew I had a unique kind of outlook in terms of my spirituality, and I had already gone through a couple of near-death experiences and survived. I had had a cousin who passed away when I was very young, and there was a week where we were basically living with his spirit in my family home, and I would take on his persona, and channel. We were the same age, so I was channeling my buddy, and so my mom knew there was something unique about my spiritual gifts, and she did try to encourage that, if I have any precognitive types of dreams, to let her know. And she told me times that she had had dreams about the future, or dreams of, I'm sure a lot of people can relate, where you just something bad's going to happen, or you dream of an accident, someone that you love is in an accident, so you call and warn them. I think it is part of a lot of people's experience to have those kinds of things. And so my mom definitely did not dampen that in me. But it also wasn't highly encouraged, and it wasn't ever like something that you could go and just that's all you did for a living. So I was really kind of obsessed with being a pastor or something along those lines. And because I had already, had premarital sex, I was like, well, can't do that, because I'm scarlet letter woman. I'm ruined stuff, right? We have such ideas of purity when it comes to spiritual teachers and teaching, and who can and who can't deliver messages from the realms of the divine. So I didn't do it. And what ended up happening is I never felt good enough. I never felt like I was quite good enough to actually be some kind of spiritual messenger of any form. And so I was just going to have a regular old life like everybody else, even though I had had these really strange and intense spiritual experiences from the time I was young. So now I'm 19 years old, and 2 years passed having fallen off the cliff, and the depth of that intervention was so miraculous that if you haven't seen the video, watch the video about me falling off the cliff. So this is 2 years after that, and so much of my life got better, actually, and it was such a miracle. So I couldn't deny the things from my childhood and the way that it felt like the supernatural world was interacting with me. So I'm 19 years old. I get it in my head that I need to try acid. I must do LSD at this point. I was pretty innocent. I hadn't really, a little bit of experimental drinking in my teenage years, but nothing, out of the ordinary, or not too extraordinary means. It was just like every now and again something, the teenagers sometimes find themselves doing. And so now I'm moving on, and I'm going to do some acid. And I don't know where this thought came into my head. It was one of those things I feel like throughout my life, every once in a while, Spirit wants you to do something, and it gives you a nudge. And although the challenge may be difficult, they tend to be very much worth it. So this nudge brought me to the realm of psychedelics. And the first 2 times I did it, I think I did it 4 times in total. First 2 times I did it, not too big of a deal. The third and fourth time were actually 2 days in a row. And so it was like a really extended trip outside of reality into other dimensions. And there was a few weird things that came up from that. One was that I had this, it's like I suddenly realized how much influence we actually have over each other's actions without even necessarily saying anything. So I could tell that if I stared at someone, I could make them uncomfortable. If I stared at their arm, they would want to, kind of itch their arm. And it didn't matter really how far away a person was. You could stare at them long enough and catch their attention. And so I also did that with, sending thoughts to see if I don't stare at them, but I do send a thought their direction, will that catch it? And so that was like the gist of my trip, was this strange communication with, yeah, a communication experiment, if you will, with other people. And the next one and the last one was extremely intense. It was as if I was reliving an event that didn't happen. And it's kind of hard to explain. I'll do the best I can. Essentially, what the trip was about was that I had really died when I had fallen off the cliff. And I could see God's throne, if you will. It was just a star. But in my mind, in my trippy mind, it was God's throne. And I had been abandoned on earth. And so, if you can imagine the feeling of being abandoned by God, left to earth, died but didn't get to go home, right? And I had always just, I loved the shit out of God. So it was like, but how could you do this to me? How could you abandon me? Meanwhile, it was night now, day 2 of an extended LSD trip. And meanwhile, all the lights went out. So there was no electricity, there was no lights. Someone decided to put Black Hole Sun on the boombox on repeat. So no lights. The street light was flashing red. Black Hole Sun was playing repeatedly. The guy that I was hanging out with, who I eventually married, who was there when I fell off the cliff also, his roommate was studying to be a monk. He was in the process of taking the training that he needed before he took his vows to become a monk. And he had a robe, a red robe on, and he was pretty freaked out by the fact that I was on LSD, and his whole vibe was kind of judgmental. And the entirety of that scenario felt so much like a trip into the underworld, which is one of the shamanic initiation, one of the clues that you are undergoing a shamanic initiation is that you get taken into your version of the underworld, because you are worth nothing as a shaman if you can't bring people back from their version of hell. And the only thing that would stop you is that you would be afraid of your own. That's the gist of it. So mine was that I was abandoned by God and I was trapped in some kind of hell. Hellscape, not the real thing, right? So all of this was going on. So I started screaming at the top of my lungs, God. I mean, at the top of my lungs, I was screaming out to God, up to the heavens. It was, it could bring tears to my eyes right now thinking about it. So, I am believing, right, that God had abandoned me, that I had died. I had died 2 years previously. Didn't get to go to heaven. Stuck on earth. Surrounded by judgmental people. And no light. And, the music that was just like the perfect symphony to this horrible thought, right? And because I had been yelling God at the top of my lungs, someone called the police because they thought that I was yelling gun. So now the police show up, and there is a bunch of them. And they think that I have a gun because that's what somebody said. Luckily, the soon-to-be monk was able to convince them that I was actually screaming God, and that I didn't have any weapons, and that I had taken LSD. They did still hog-tie me and carry me out to the lawn, at which point I thought the trip I was having was that none of this is real and I can think my way out of it. So I tried for the next 15 minutes to get my wrists to be able to get the metal handcuffs off. So yes, you create your own reality, but you got to be better than metal. You got to know how to separate your atoms and get them to come on the other side of the bracelet. I was not at that stage of my spiritual journey, so I just ended up with a shit ton of really painful bruises. But just to give you an idea of what the experience was like, I was really, that's where I was. So the police officers loaded me into an ambulance. Ambulance brought me downtown to the hospital. The hospital brought me in and strapped me on a bed. And I lay strapped on that bed for the duration of the rest of that psychedelic trip, which was about 4.5 hours. During that time, and I'm in an ER, right? There's just a little curtain separating me from everybody else. And I got it firmly stuck in my mind that I must ignore anything that was negative so that I don't get stuck in the hellscape, and I must only focus on positive and light. And that's what I did for the next 4 hours, was attempted to bring myself closer into the understanding of beauty, light, unconditional love, reconnecting with God, not feeling this fear that he was a million miles away and had left me. And it was a really intense experience. And then, I would hear people talking about like these horrible things that, is the ER, and they're coming in and these horrible things. And so I was learning how to tune out that negative voice of other people, or the trauma that other people are going through, so that I wouldn't get sucked into it, and to highly focus my attention only on the relationship between me and the love that I was feeling from God. It's like I could not take my eyes away from him for a second. I was afraid that I would get left again behind. It was really intense, and thinking back on it and everything that I've come through since then, that's really, that pinnacle experience really informed so much of my spirituality, about not being afraid of abandonment. I think that was the just resounding message, was that it didn't make sense that God was a star in the sky and that he had actually abandoned me here on earth. So after the trip was over and I started coming through, I was like engulfed in a sense of peace, and I felt the presence of God everywhere. And when I say God, I mean divinity, divine love, the caretaking, unconditional support. And we stepped outside that morning, and the clouds were like those super beautiful, big, white, fluffy clouds with the most picturesque blue sky. And it's like everything like restarted in my life again. I had come through this strange trip of believing I had died and gotten stuck on earth. And here I was getting a chance to actually be walking on earth with God as my guide. So that was like one of my earlier spiritual initiations into seeing reality a little bit differently and outside of the box. And they only got more intense from there. So I'll come back again with another story next time I decide it's share hour for YouTube. So anyways, I hope you find something to resonate with there. I think we can get kind of mired down into our like judgmental nature and how people need to be, and we can be afraid sometimes to talk about the intense experiences we had that brought us closer to a sense of divinity. It isn't all just watching YouTube videos about non-duality and suddenly understanding that we're all connected. Some of us really had to have very intense awakenings where, we were really shaken out of our core. And I think especially if it was, if you have something that your soul feels really compelled to do, there will be more of an intense initiation where you are going to be trained in order to meet the demands of the energetic and spiritual world, and to help pull people out of some of the dark places they can get to, especially as we move into the realms of technology, where we are creating environments, virtual environments for people to share with us. It'd be really great if those can be healthy and joyful places to be, and that we're not inviting people into our dark spaces and things of that nature, and those hellscapes. So if you deal with some of that on your own through an initiation, you can be more of a grounding force as people explore their own spirituality. So just some thoughts to think about. All right, well, thank you for listening, and thank you for joining me, and I will see you again next time. Take care.